Okay. So first of all, I'd like to say that that was a terrific video, and it gave a lot of history and definitely connected the East Coast with the West Coast. What I'd like to make it clear is that the Acupuncture Collective, and it was a collective effort. It wasn't just me or two. It was six of us in the collective, and out of the six, four of us got scholarships and graduated from the Quebec Institute of Acupuncture. So if we talk about what happened in the early 60s and the 70s, we have to understand that we came from a revolutionary perspective because the world was in revolution. It wasn't just us in the United States. We had the war, we had the civil rights movement in the 50s, then we had the movements in the 60s as far as the anti-war movement, you know, the war in Vietnam made a lot of people take a look at what was happening in America. We understood then at Lincoln Hospital because we were radicals. And actually, I still have my little red book. I don't know if anybody could see it, but here's my little red book I've been carrying for 50 years. Anyway, so it was a collective effort. The collective, the Acupuncture Collective, was organized by Mutulu Shakur, myself, and four other members: Richard Delaney, Ricky Bird, Wafia, and Hassan. They were brothers and sisters. Only four of us went to Montreal and graduated in 1977. But as I was saying, is that we were in revolutionary times. So it wasn't difficult to be part of a movement that had been created from the 50s on. After World War II, the movement started to take hold simply because many soldiers were coming back from World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War addicted to morphine. If people understand that in the battlefield, morphine is a very important painkiller. So every war comes back with soldiers addicted to that particular substance. But back in the 60s and the 70s, there were over 100,000 people addicted to heroin in New York State, and in particular, the 5 boroughs of New York City. And we, as members of the Young Lords and activists working with the Black Panthers, we decided that it was necessary, absolutely necessary, to get people off of heroin. And so we demanded in 1970, we had taken over, the Young Lords had taken over the hospital twice. The second time we demanded the drug program. The first time we demanded patients' rights. And if you go to a hospital now and you see a patient's right bill up on the wall, that was the results of our first takeover of Lincoln Hospital. The second takeover of Lincoln Hospital was the demand for a detox program. Prior to 1970, methadone was a substance. Methadone was a substance that was used to pacify the people in the community. So if you have problems with heroin, they would send you to Lexington, Kentucky to join a methadone program, and then you would be on a methadone program for the rest of your life. We would call it liquid handcuffs, because once you were on methadone maintenance, your travels were restricted. You couldn't just go to Puerto Rico and visit my grandmother because I had to take my methadone and they would not give me my methadone to go to the island. And that's just an example. Couldn't go to Chicago, couldn't go to California. So we call methadone liquid handcuffs because you were handcuffed to a particular community and you could not leave it. So in 1970, when we demanded and fought a bit of battle with the city administration, luckily at that time it was Lindsay that was in City Hall, and he was much liberal kind of guy, and actually turned out to be a pretty good politician if you follow his history. When he passed away recently, I think a couple of years ago, he was the only politician that I knew that passed away and was not a millionaire. He just wasn't into making money. He was into serving the community. So I got to give him kudos for that. But anyway, we started our detox program in 1970. What we did was, because methadone was the only thing available in the hospital, was we started a 10-day detox cycle. So we would take our clients, put them on methadone. I mean, of course, we would give them physical therapy. We would give them a physical examination. We would take a history. We would take their blood. We would examine any medical problems that they may have to refer them to other clinics. And then we would put them on a 10-day detox cycle, which meant that for 10 days, they would take methadone, starting with 40 milligrams, 35, 30, 25, all the way to the end of 10 days, where they then would have 5 milligrams left and basically detoxed. The last 5 milligrams were a little bit hard, so we gave them a lot of therapy, a lot of love, and definitely a lot of political education. And so from there, we began to realize that the heroin epidemic was causing much trouble in our community. But added to that, the methadone became another epidemic. Actually, methadone was probably the first opioid epidemic in New York City, simply because methadone, being a synthetic drug, worked on the body differently than heroin. Heroin was a natural drug. Methadone was a synthetic drug. And so if you take methadone in the 70s and you take the opioid epidemic now in 2019, you could see the similarities, that the synthetic drugs are much more difficult to detox from. So what happened was, if you overdose on heroin in the 70s, they would take you to an emergency room. They would give you Narcan, which has become very popular now these days, and you would snap out of your overdose and you would go home and go to sleep. But if you overdose on methadone, a synthetic opioid, they would give you the Narcan, send you home, but in the middle of the night, because methadone was a synthetic drug, it would reoccur. You would reoccur and wind up having another overdose in the middle of the night, and many people just never woke up. Added to this problem, since the clinics were not open 7 days a week, they would give the clients a take-home dose. And usually it was a little bottle with a little orange juice. At the time, they used to use Tang. I don't know if people remember what Tang was. You got to be a baby boomer to remember what Tang was. But anyway, it was an orange-flavored drink that would be mixed with methadone, because methadone was a clear liquid. So they would take that whole weekend dose home. And so a lot of people would sell it and created a black market selling methadone in the street, because many people preferred heroin to methadone. So they would sell the methadone in the street to buy heroin. And that became a greater problem, because now you were buying methadone in the street and you really didn't know how much dose was in that little bottle. You don't know if it was 10 milligrams or 40 milligrams. And methadone being more powerful than heroin, that was one of the problems with the overdose. Not to add to the fact that a lot of people, when they took the methadone home, their children would wake up in the middle of the night and see a little orange bottle in the refrigerator, thinking it was orange juice. They would drink it and they would overdose. So we had the emergency full of people with heroin overdose, methadone overdose, and quite a few children overdosing as well. So it became an epidemic. It became a mess. And we, the activists in New York City, the Young Lords, the Black Panthers, the Atrium, and other radicals of the time, decided that we had to do something to stop this methadone mess. Now, although we introduced methadone in our community with the detox program, we realized by 1972 that the methadone had become an epidemic as well. So we were looking for an alternative. And it's like the film was saying, that Mutulu and the rest of the collective, because I want to make it clear, it wasn't just Mutulu or I, it was a collective effort. The detox program was a collective effort. The acupuncture clinic was a collective effort. And that's how it worked, and that's how the whole department worked. There were no leaders, there were no power people in charge. They were a collective effort. Every department in the program, from the administrative department to the medical department, to the nurses department, were all collectives. So by 1972, we decided we were going to experiment and find an alternative to methadone. And acupuncture became that alternative. So in 1972, Mottula has his story. He went down to Chinatown. I have my story. We read the articles from Bangkok, Thailand, from Hong Kong, and Mottula and I said, we got to try it. And the collective agreed to go to California because California was the only state in the union that was certifying acupuncturists, because most people who came from Asia first arrived in the West Coast. So there were a lot of acupuncturists at that time. Although it was illegal in New York to do acupuncture unless you were an MD, it wasn't illegal in California. So if you were a licensed acupuncturist in California, you could practice. So we decided that we were going to start this acupuncture collective. So the medical collective became the acupuncture collective, and we started detoxing people with acupuncture. Keep in mind, we're still doing the 10-day detox with the methadone, but at the end of those 5 milligrams, we then really get heavy into doing the auricular therapy. And we start giving them political education. We always gave our clients political education. It was important for us as radicals that we needed to show people where they came from. So it was very important to have a historical background, to understand that you weren't born an addict, you were made an addict. If on your way to school, you ran into 5 dealers in the street offering you free drugs, because they always offer you free drugs until you get addicted, and then there's no more credit. So we had to educate them, re-educate the people, and explain to them that this whole opium cartel, heroin cartel had a historical background that goes back to the British Empire. The Boxer Rebellion was one of the issues that we stressed in our political education, explaining to them that the Chinese were dominated by the imperial powers because of opium. And by the way, opium wasn't grown in China. Opium was grown in India. And now the Golden Triangle has become very popular because that's where it comes from now. And that's where it's been coming from for the longest time. So we educated our clients. A lot of them became political, became activists, and became volunteers. And we recruited them into all kinds of collectives, political prisoners collective, community collectives, rent strikes. And this is how we became so popular that the program was called the People's Program. But at the same time, as Mottula explained in that clip, we became a problem to the establishment who were challenging the powers that be. Not to mention that Eli Lilly wanted to have methadone maintenance at Lincoln Hospital. And for those 7.5 years that we were in charge, we did not allow Eli Lilly to have methadone maintenance in Lincoln Hospital. So one thing led to the other, and in 1974, we're invited to the Acupuncture World Conference. Every year there was an Acupuncture World Conference. This particular year, 1974, it would be in Quebec, in Montreal. And so we said, well, it's just a skip and a hop to get to Montreal. So we went to Montreal. Mottula went, representing the collective. He brought down his stats. He gave a presentation at the conference. They were so impressed, especially the Wexu team, father and son team, that were the creators of the Institute of Acupuncture in Quebec. They were so impressed with Mottula's presentation that they offered us 6 scholarships to go to Montreal and study at their institute. 4 of us accepted the scholarships, and we went up to Montreal, and we received our diplomas in 1977. So now we were acupuncturists, although we still could not practice because we were not medical doctors, and only medical doctors could practice in the 70s and the 80s. It wasn't until 1991 that the acupuncture bill was amended. So in the 70s, we decided that we were going to come back, start doing full acupuncture body points, but we couldn't open up our own practice. So we decided then that we would open up a school. And in 1977, when we graduated and returned to Lincoln Hospital, we decided that we were going to create the Lincoln Hospital Acupuncture School, the first of its kind. And from that point on, young people from all over the tri-state area, middle-class kids, black and brown, white, came to Lincoln Hospital Acupuncture School and registered for the curriculum. It was a 3-year curriculum, and we started teaching, and we had our clinic. And by 1980, although we were no longer at Lincoln, because we had actually gotten disbanded in 1979, we were able to graduate at least 30 plus students with their diplomas, because we became an annex to the Quebec Institute. So Mario would come down and give lectures and tests and midterms, and that's how we worked the Lincoln School. Now, what happens from that point on is that those 30 plus students spread out through the tri-state area, and they start opening up their own clinics. Most of them moved down to Florida, where it was legit back in those days to practice. Some went to California, got licensed out there, and they spread out around the country. But we created the first people's acupuncture school, because what we also had to tell our clients as far as the political education classes was that acupuncture and traditional Chinese medicine back in the early times, we're talking about the dynasties, the emperors, only the upper class had access to medical physicians, acupuncturists, martial artists, masters of all kinds of arts. The regular working people didn't have access to that. The working people, which were basically peasants on the farm, just worked, just like they did in this country when we had slavery and after slavery. We did not have access to those medical modalities. So we wanted to present and introduce traditional Chinese medicine to the South Bronx community, which we did. Now, unfortunately, by 1979, the Koch administration decided that they were going to move on us because we were too radical, and we were. I mean, we have to accept the fact that the anti-war movement, the women's liberation movement, the independence movement for Puerto Rico, the independence movement for African nations, that was a threat to the establishment. And that's what we were educating our people, to bring consciousness, to open hearts and minds, to make a revolution. We were living in a revolutionary period. So there was no way that we could do anything else but contribute to that movement. That movement became our extended family, something that's not in existence at the present time. And therefore, a lot of people who get stuck on drugs, opioids, heroin, crack, cocaine, they don't have that extended family. They don't have that movement. There are small movements still happening in America, but in reality, it wasn't the movements of the 70s that really changed the world. We have to take credit that the anti-war movement made a dent in Nixon's war in Vietnam. John Ehrlichman, who was his counsel, you saw a little clip about what they were doing. They were purposely stopping the movement by incarcerating our people. It wasn't until we started the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement that all of a sudden our communities were flooded with heroin. That, to this day, has been questioned. How did that happen? I tell people all the time, if I wanted a Cuban cigar, I couldn't buy one in the grocery store down the block because the government would not allow Cuban cigars into America. But yet I could buy all the heroin, cocaine, crack that I wanted right down the block. So let's look at the picture. Like I said, it wasn't easy. It was a bittersweet struggle. We lost a lot of good brothers and sisters. I mentioned that I spoke to Mutulu on the phone yesterday. He called me up. He wants to send everybody his love. He wants everybody to understand that we were the pioneers that created the NADA protocol at Lincoln Detox in the 1970s. In 1974, when Richard Taft is found dead, the late Dr. Michael Smith becomes the medical director. And at that point, Michael becomes the director, and we work close with him because we needed a medical director to sign off on the paperwork. I personally think that they killed Taft because that way they would scare any other doctor from picking up the mantle. And it was true. No other doctor wanted the position, but the late Dr. Michael Smith did, and he became the medical director. From that point on, it's history. Unfortunately, because of the pressure put on Mike, he was able to survive the program for over 30 years, and I give him credit for that. Kudos to the late Dr. Michael Smith. He did a great job, made it international, took it all over the country, to the reservations, the Black Hills of South Dakota, and he really did an excellent job. Unfortunately, the history was not completed. So now a lot of NADA members look at the history of the Lincoln Detox Program from 1974 on, when Michael Smith became the director. But actually, the Lincoln Detox Program started in 1970. And we were at Lincoln Hospital for 7.5 years before they moved on us and transferred us out. They actually transferred us out. What they did was they took all the leaders of the collectives, the unit heads, not the leaders, but the unit heads of each collective, which were 12. We had 12 collectives. They took those unit heads and they transferred us over to other municipal hospitals, which were basically methadone maintenance programs. So we couldn't do acupuncture and we couldn't politicize the people, and most of us just resigned. I went my way, Mutulu went his way. Mutulu created Banner, so he had something to work on. I created PRANA, Puerto Rican Acupuncture Association of North America. It never got off the ground. And so this is what I mean about the history is a history of struggle. It's a bittersweet history because we did lose a lot of people. Mutulu's been in jail for 35 years. You know, a lot of our people, when we lost the People's Detox Program, because without the politics, people went back and started using drugs again, and we lost a lot of good people. But Banner was created in 1980, and to this day, it's still incorporated. We continue the struggle. I recommend that you watch the film, The People's Detox by Jenna Bliss, and Dope is Death by Mia Donovan. Very good documentary on what happened back in the 70s and who the players were, who the pioneers were, and how to this day, there's still a pulse and we're still breathing and the struggle continues.